morning, Madeline and everyone else. And I see we've now got 328 folks signed up, and ultimately we'll have hundreds more. So that's a real plus. It's an honor for me to introduce Marika Cox Mitchell, one of the great figures in early childhood in this country. And she is the perfect speaker. Indeed, if you look back just a few decades, it seems to me just about obvious that she was destined to be with us this morning. Her whole being brings us here. She's the middle of three children. She grew up in the nation's capital. She's the daughter of two professionals who emphasized education and had an abundance of love to share. And if you ask her about her earliest memories, they go back to her architect father reading Mother Goose. And now if you dig deeper to understand the relevance of Mother Goose fairy tales and rhymes, and I did, you will quickly learn that Mother Goose was, quote, born to tell stories and raise children's hearts, close quote. And that seems fitting today. From her earliest years, she was trusted by her parents and others to shepherd not only her siblings, but so many other children in the neighborhood, at church and school. She grew up thinking she might be a builder, perhaps in construction, a field akin to her father's career. She started college not sure whether she would choose a career in construction or early learning. She ended up choosing the latter. She worked her way through college and earned 2 degrees in early childhood education. She taught pre-K and second grade. Not as the sort of teacher who tells you what to do and what to think, but rather the sort of classroom leader who encouraged children to ask questions. Her favorite group of children, 3-year-olds. She was a key figure in the DC superintendent's office, leading initiatives on school preparedness and professional development. And then the next chapter, the one just before this one, was as a significant leader in the National Association for the Education of Young Children, NAEYC being this country's premier association to advance high-quality early learning. These past 4 years, Marika Cox Mitchell has been the vice president of the early childhood arena for the Bynum Family Foundation, which is based just outside DC, and whose mission envisions, quote, a future where all children thrive. She's devoted to her work, her husband of 22 years, her 3 children, and still has enough time for visiting friends and to live out her bargain hunting passion of thrift stores and yard sales, enough time to watch episodes of the Housewives of Atlanta, and to read books about policy, most recently Matthew Desmond's Important Poverty by America. Marika Cox Mitchell is nationally known for her leadership in the transformation of early learning. The future is now, she will tell us, and we will have to be bold enough to achieve a reimagined future that will necessitate significant pivoting to get there. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to present Marika Cox Mitchell, who can help us all to learn and grow. Marika, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me be a part of your conference this morning. And thank you so much for that introduction, that human introduction that paints me more than just a resume, but as a diehard early childhood educator and futurist. And the futurism part of my work is what excites me and what attracted the Bynum Family Foundation to partner with the children's movement of Florida. So for a moment, we're going to step into the future of early learning, and this can be the essence of the conversation. So we're just going to start with some grounding from bell hooks, who tells us that what we cannot imagine cannot come into being. If we don't imagine it, it is not going to happen. I'm also going to share another quote from one of my favorite philosophers. You may know him, David Lawrence Jr., who in his book, A Dedicated Life, shared a lot of life's lessons. And here's another life lesson pulled from that book, this idea that the adventure of life is making the difficult, the sometimes seemingly impossible, come to being. And this is the essence of our work at the Bainham Family Foundation, as well as the Children's Movement of Florida with the Future Project. So we're going to be in imagination land right now to ensure that young children and families thrive. But often we talk about the future of early learning, and we don't focus on what is it and who is defining it. If you do a Google search for the childcare crisis, you will receive millions and millions of hits. If you do a Google search about childcare solutions, you will get a few, comparatively speaking. So it means that we've been surviving in the system, focusing on the pain points of the system, but have not quite focused on, so what does it look like? I've been in the early childhood field for more than 25 years, and the level of visibility the field is receiving, the level of visibility the childcare crisis is receiving, the focused attention early childhood educators' well-being and compensation, I've never seen it at this level. Early childhood education or childcare remains one of the few bipartisan issues we still have in this country. And so this is an important time for us to lean into futurism work and be very clear about what is the future as well as who's defining it. Yes, we know the childcare system is broken. And now the public is asking us, so what? What do you want? Here's a very tangible example. Rachel Cohen, who writes for Vox, is the ally we want, the perfect media ally, who wrote extensively about the childcare crisis from every angle, from the perspective of families needing quality care and affordable care, from the perspective of administrators trying to make the math of childcare make sense. Surprise, it does not. From the perspective of employees who could not find workers because of the childcare crisis, as well as the perspective of early childhood educators who were making subpar wages and do not feel like valued educators. About 8 months in, she paused for a second and was like, what is this crisis again? And posed a question, frankly, to all of us and said that we all should be very clear about what we actually want to fix. That certainly the childcare system is broken, but we're not quite clear about what the future should be. And it makes sense. Many would even say we don't have an early learning system or a childcare system, that what we have is this complex, complicated, overly bureaucratic blending of funding streams, and each funding stream, be it public or private or philanthropic, has its own set of standards and own set of expectation. Many are not paying for the true cost of quality early learning. So it comes as no surprise that we're quite complicated. I often say in conversations, we're like the Facebook status. It's just complicated. We throw a lot of jargon at the public. We talk about even the childcare workers, right? We call them daycare workers at times. We call them providers. Then we have home providers. Then we use friends, family, and neighbor care. And then we call them early childhood educators, in some cases, early childhood teachers. It gets really, really complicated. And we talk about the childcare subsidy system. And then you have the Head Start advocates who talk about Head Start, which is also separate from early Head Start. And then comes public pre-K, and public pre-K is part day. So yes, our complexity and our the way in which it's really difficult for us to define and describe the future is certainly rooted in the ways in which we're funded, and I think it's important to own that. And what do we see in our work, whether it's in Florida, in Orlando, with the West Lakes Early Learning Center and programs in the Lift Orlando community, or Washington, D.C., where we fund early learning programs in centers and homes, or our work in Toledo, Ohio, we see that the most sustainable programs have to also blend these funding streams. And so it's really difficult for us to have future-facing conversations and futuristic conversations when we're wedded to the ways in which we're funded. In some ways, we're going to have to unpack the various funding streams to answer this question about what is it. Equally important is who gets to define it. In this field, we often talk about research, policy, and practice. Research, policy, and practice, and the importance of all of these three components. I think the reality is what we really mean is researchers, and in some case, policymakers, telling the practitioners and families what they ought to do. It is unduly hierarchical trio. And as we think about the future and who needs to define it, it's important for us to flatten the hierarchy and pause for a second. And that means philanthropic folks like Marika, policy women like Marika will have to pause for a second and actually ask those closest to young children, and what do they want in their future? And this is what we're doing with the We Vision Early Ed Project. We spend 7 months with a cohort of 35, we call them proximity experts, families, educators, and program administrators, asking them about what do they want to see in their ideal early learning system, one that does not currently exist. We have since taken the show on the road. We have an interactive exhibit where we are asking, again, these proximity experts, as we call them, to define what they want in their ideal system, and let's make it as concrete and real as possible. We were just in Florida, in Orlando, for the Florida Association for the Education of Young Children's Conference, collecting data from attendees about what do they want to see in their ideal system. And again, making space for the proximity experts, those who work directly with young children and families, to define it. Which is why we're really excited about our partnership with the Children's Movement of Florida and the Future Project. This idea of centering the solutions around the needs and wants of families and educators. And it's impressive that this work was shaped. 70% of those who defined the future in this work were families and educators. So here's what we've been hearing. Again, whether we're in Washington, D.C., Toledo, Ohio, Orlando, Florida, Northern Virginia, we have a project in Maryland as well. What families, educators, and administrators pretty much want is they want to make child-centered decisions and quality-centered decisions. And even when they're asking for appropriate resources, streamlined regulations, a seat at the table, more FTEs because they're wearing too many hats, when they ask for a system that's constructed by the people in the system, or shared vocabulary, or adult well-being, right? They're doing it. They're like, I just want all of these resources so I can be better at making child-centered and quality-centered decisions. And so, frankly, that was eye-opener to us. I think we were expecting this really, really complicated feedback about what the future should look like, and for it to be as simple and important as just child-centered, quality-centered decision-making was really an eye-opener. And in many ways, it tells us that simplicity is the early learning innovation. It is that simple. And so when we look at that list of what proximity experts wanted to see in their ideal system, and it certainly aligns with what we see in the future project findings, it is clear that they don't want tinkering, right? They don't want us to simply change a licensing standard or simply increase minimum wage or simply align Head Start performance standards with the NAEYC accreditation standards. They're asking us to transform the system, and some would argue build the system beyond what it is right now, which is a complicated blend of funding streams. And to transform systems, we're all going to have to do some changing. We're all going to have to do some shifting and shifting the mindsets we've been holding in place. I know I've been holding some mindsets in place since I've been in this field for 25 plus years. That's exactly what we're going to have to do to transform the system. And it is really difficult. We all want change, but we all don't want to change. And so this idea of mindset shifting as a necessity for getting to that future that was defined by the 70% of educators and families through the Future Project is really important. And this is the science of systems change. If you want systems change to occur, you're going to have to change at all levels. The transformative change really happens at the level we all don't see. And that's the mental models. Like, what are the mindsets we're holding in place? What are the power dynamics? I talked about the research, policy, and practice hierarchy. Like, how do we change that? How do we increase relationships and connections? That's what's necessary for transformative shifts and transformative change to occur. What we see at the structure level, the regulations, the way in which childcare or early learning is funded, the inaccessibility of programs for families, the policies that just do not make sense, they're all in place because of a mental model. So I'll take the subsidy of the childcare subsidy system as an example. The root and origin of the childcare subsidy system, the mental model of the childcare subsidy system was about labor productivity. It was getting families, mostly women, off the welfare system so that they can enter the workforce, and specifically the low-wage workforce. And so it comes as no surprise that if that's the mental model and not child growth and development and not quality center practices, it comes as no surprise then that that mental model is creating the system we currently see, where the resource does not cover the true cost of quality early childhood education or early learning. It comes as no surprise that the regulations are unduly burdensome. It comes as no surprise that quality isn't a part of the way in which the policies and the resources are flowing. So these mental models impact the policies, which is why in this systems change work, in this futurism work, we're not ready to start writing policies until we really pressure test these mental models and frankly unpack and let go of these antiquated mental models. So here are the 5 core mindset shifts we're all going to have to make, and then ensure that they're reflected in the policies we seek and advance. One is that birth to 5 experiences or educational experiences, or like the Future Project frames it, learning begins at birth. It does not begin in pre-K with a couple of hours for 4-year-olds. It does not begin in kindergarten. It does not begin in first grade. The way in which we're funded, this mental model that school begins in kindergarten or pre-K and everything that happens before is, again, keeping young children safe so that the families can work. We have to let go of that outdated mental model. And the brain science is absolutely making it clear why we need to get rid of that mental model. So this idea, again, that learning begins at birth and that the birth through 5 experiences are educational experiences is a core shift that we're all going to have to make, and then ensure that they're reflected in the policies we advance, the way we should talk about ourselves. Key to that then means if learning begins at birth and the birth to five experiences are educational experiences, and indeed our public education systems should be funded to reflect that mindset, then that means those doing the work are early childhood educators. That means only early childhood educators in our society should be held responsible and frankly accountable for those intentionally planned early learning experiences, which is not how early childhood educators are supported, funded, and this is not how we view them in society. There's the teacher, the educator, and we often think of someone in a public school system, and then there's sort of the early childhood workforce and all the labels in which we use to define them. All families need childcare is the second core mindset shift, and everyone's like, yeah, duh. But again, if we look at the narratives that we use to define this problem, while indeed, because of the racism and elitism and classism that's embedded in our system, there's some families who struggle the most in accessing quality care, but that doesn't mean it is working well for other families. I often say a colleague of mine, fellow vice president at the SNAP Foundation, quit her job because of childcare challenges. I just had lunch with another team member who works in the on the IT side of our organization, and so far they've had 3 family childcare experiences because they're trying to find quality childcare. So yes, this does not mean that some families it's not more challenging some for families that are from marginalized communities, but we have to reframe the way in which we talk about it. Early childhood education, early learning, all children deserve it and need to have access to it. All families need it. And we just have to normalize sort of that frame versus presenting early learning as this poverty intervention, as solely a poverty intervention mechanism for those kids. And we know exactly who those kids are. So we need to really reframe that. The other piece is it costs. It definitely costs more than families are paying for right now. Even families who are paying as much as a college tuition in some cases, it's going to cost more. It's going to cost more than we currently reimburse programs for in the childcare subsidy system. I'll argue even our pre-K systems are not paying the true cost of quality. It is going to cost, and we all will have to pay for it. Like we all pay for the library, whether or not we use it, or the playground at our community center, or the roads. It's a public good, and we're all going to have to contribute to it. And it definitely costs more than what we're paying for. And again, just to sort of highlight how we're not kind of ready for that future, then the question is, what does it cost and who is determining that cost? Are the program administrators in the room and families in the room when decisions about what childcare costs or early learning costs? And I'll argue most oftentimes not, which is why the math just doesn't add up, is what we hear from our proximity experts. We're also not ready for the future. In our work, we don't want to just talk about it. We want to be about it, like my teenagers would say. When we ask our partners, our early learning program administrators, so what is the true cost? It was amazing to me that it took them about 3 weeks to tell me that cost, because no one has ever asked them. No one has ever asked them, what does a high quality infant seat cost in your program for 12 months? And yes, include an educator compensated just like the educator in the K-12 system. And yes, include vacation hours. Yes, include PD. Yes, include the janitor, include field trips, include learning materials, PD experiences, absolutely. Include a ratio that is child-centered and quality-centered. What does it cost? And like I said, it took about 3 weeks for us to get the numbers back. we'll get the numbers, we'll look at it and be like, something's not making sense. Why are the numbers so low? And they'll be like, well, because we assumed the summer camp kids will come in and cover the cost of the infants. We were like, don't make that assumption. What does it cost? So as we advocate for this future system, we need to be very clear about what it costs and frankly, very unapologetic about what it costs. The fourth mindset shift is around quality. Quality is just the baseline expectation. Quality is the floor. It is not the ceiling. It is not this high-end ask of competent early childhood educators. I've worked in programs where that was just the norm. It's like, good morning, you're working in this program, and we follow the best practice defined by this profession, because early childhood education is a distinct profession. And that was it. It was just no questions asked. And I've worked in other programs where quality just wasn't the baseline. It was like, keep the kids safe and keep them warm. And if you implement developmentally appropriate practice, if you differentiate instruction, if you create multiple experiences for families to be engaged and inform programming, it was like, you're doing too much. And so how do we, and even the way in which we have our quality rating and improvement systems, and I know it looks different in across states, there's still this notion that you get 5-star for meeting a baseline. So, and again, all of this is tied to how it's funded and all those funding streams I talked about. But to prepare for the future, we have to go into the future with this idea that quality is an expected baseline. We expect that from manicurists. We expect that from dog groomers. We expect quality from our Starbucks baristas. We expect quality from pediatricians. We expect a baseline. And in early childhood or early education or early learning, a baseline has to be expected. It's not a luxury. It's not 5-star. It's not optional. And right now, it is quite optional. And then the fifth core shift is governance and decision-making, right? It has to be shared governance and decision-making. One of my mentors often pushed the envelope by suggesting that early childhood education, or frankly, education, it may not even be a profession because of the way in which we don't govern ourselves compared to other professions. That a hallmark of calling your field a profession is your ability to self-govern and make decisions about your practice. If an outsider, a researcher, policymaker, commission, can come in and tell you what quality is in your space, in your field, is a sign that you're really not quite a profession. Again, a very extreme, rigid definition of profession, but I think we should continue to think about that. So much of what happens in the space are governance decisions made without early childhood education being respected as a profession. And Florida has a really good examples of that. I often compare the way in which we're governed with the way in which nurses are governed. The American Nursing Association is respected for the role that they play in setting professional standards, and their standards are the baseline. Certainly government entities and government agencies and Department of Health have roles, but that role sort of leverages the American Nursing Association, their guidelines. All nurses have to pass the NCLEX exam. The NCLEX exam is a national exam. So there are lots to be said about governance and decision-making in this space. And if we are to prepare for the future of early learning, the one mindset we're going to have to change is this idea of shared governance and being clear about who's making decision. So if we were to leap into the future, here's what it could look like. It could be this clear, simplicity is the innovation. Just like families want funded options and they want clear options. And in this future, in this childcare future or early learning future, you see their early childhood education programs can exist in many settings. It can exist in a center-based setting. It can exist in a home-based setting. It certainly can exist in a school-based setting. And if it's an early childhood education program, regardless of what the building looks like, the early childhood educators in that space are comparably compensated and prepared. And here's where the mindsets get a little tricky. And we also need to leave room and space for families who prefer a trusted caregiver. These are individuals who are family members or who the families deem an extension of their family, who are responsible for caring for their children. It is important, but not the same as early childhood education performed by early childhood educators. The level of accountability is different, and I'll even argue the level of funding has to be different. Every time we've tried to advance an initiative that elevates one quarter of these options at the expense of other, we don't see the outcomes. We don't see young children thriving. So it has to be all or frankly nothing. In many ways, public pre-K tends to go more blue with the centers and definitely red with the schools. Trusted caregiver and home-based early child education programs are rarely included or visible. And so we really have to be careful and clear about what it means to be called yourself an early childhood education program. Early childhood education program will operate under the auspices, certainly of the government, as well as the profession. So what the code of ethics is not an option. You're going to have to adhere to it. Much like, again, I'll reference nurses by comparison. Whether a nurse is or LPN or RN is working in a community hospital, whether that person's actually doing a home visit, whether that nurse is at a large research hospital, their practice and their based on expectations the same. And we have to sort of think about it. Nixon vetoed our universal childcare bill, for lack of a better word. It wasn't because of politics. It passed both House and Senate. It wasn't so much because of the funding, because the funding was available. It was because the trusted caregiver option wasn't quite visible. And there was a feeling that family were eroding the fabric of America, which is families. So as we think about the future and futuristic options, it's really clear to, it's really important to be clear and figure out how we include the trusted caregiver for families who explicitly want that option. But it has to be a fair option, right? You have to say you have an early childhood education program in your community that's funded, or you can use your trusted caregiver. I think that's then a fair option. But right now, it is in this haphazard system we have, it is all over the place. And frankly, any data I see about family choice, I feel like it's really not family choice because those options do not currently exist, or it's false. It's the illusion of choice. So we're gonna have to do a lot of reimagining while we're still navigating the system. There are young children still in the system. So while we're leaping into the future and doing this futurism work, we have to be clear that we're also navigating the current system, and that both and has to be in place. And this is exactly what we see with the Florida's early learning roadmap. You're doing a really great job navigating the system as is, but also being futurists and reimagining. Again, and to end with where I started off with bell hooks, we're gonna have to be visionary, but our imagination has to be rooted in the concrete reality. It is this, we're reimagining while we're navigating. And again, to quote David Lawrence Jr., it's this idea of take risk, calculated risk, but real. And so thank you so much for having me be a part of this conversation and making the ideal early learning experiences more real for families, educators, and program administrators.
Marika, great presentation. You've given us our marching orders. Now we need to follow them. We got time for just one question. I could ask a whole bunch, but Antoinette Patterson online asked, talk about parents for a moment. How do you get them involved? if parents insisted on and knew what high quality was, it would be a sea change in my estimation of what could happen to make this country better prepared for the future and significantly more educated. Parents, please.
Parents, it's I'm gonna have to take a non-traditional approach to that. I feel like in the current system, no one has the autonomy of making choice. Like there's a sense of mistrust and distrust. I feel like if we make the options clear and quality was the baseline, we would allow for families to make their hyper individualistic decisions. I often talk about, embarrassingly, I hope my mom's not watching, about how I picked my pediatric dentist. I have a kid who has braces and will be in a dental office at least once every 2 weeks for the rest of his life, just because I don't know what's happening there. I went to affordability. Could I afford it? Does my insurance cover it? Is it near the bus stop? And are they going to allow him to be there without me? That's all. That's all I use. That was a very hyper individualistic Marika's definition for what quality pediatric dental services are. But I was able to do that because on the back end, the American Dental Association took care of their part. The state government took care of their part. So I think families know quality, and if we create this sort of baseline that allows them to use their FIGO in hyper individualistic indicators of quality, something that a government system will never capture, I think it'll be okay. It's okay for families to be like, yes, I trust the quality is the baseline. So I'm going to pick this program based on location. I'm going to pick this program based on the meal served. I don't want my child eating sandwiches. I want them eating rice. That will be my mom's quality indicator. So I think sometimes we put too much of the burden of quality on families when frankly, we need to offer quality as a baseline and give them the autonomy of using their own hyper individualistic expectations to determine quality. We do need to throw out a quality rubric to a family and say, walk around this classroom and tell me, are you seeing quality? Because I didn't do that when I'm picking my dental pediatrician. I didn't walk around with a checklist from the American Dental Association.
Great. You did splendidly, and we thank you, and we're delighted to be in real partnership with you. Thanks, Marika.